Hello and welcome to my presentation. In this, the first of two parts, I will be discussing the role that beards played in the politics and lives of the Roman Empire's ruler and its subjects, and explore the way that this fashion transformed and changed over the course of time. The Roman Empire is often seen as the height of masculine virtue, but the forms that expressions of masculinity took transformed and changed drastically during the time that it remained united. We will be analyzing this topic through one of the enduring symbols of male virility, the beard. So first, let's start with an outline. While it's become a stereotype that men think about with the Roman Empire regularly, we should ask ourselves first what the Roman Empire actually was. Rome was a city in Italy which was independent for several centuries, and over time, as its citizens fought and won wars, it began to accumulate greater territorial control. And eventually, the city could no longer control that territory independently. And so the rule was split into several different provinces. Soldiers were sent from the city to those provinces and ruled, and eventually this became kind of a pan-Italic identity, and they expanded all over the Mediterranean. The soldiers were sent to these different provinces, and they ruled the people and the land in those provinces. And so within the Roman government, the most powerful man was called imperator, which gives rise to our English word emperor. And that basically just means a victorious conqueror. This showed that Rome had accumulated control of the entire Mediterranean through strength of arms. So, although Rome now controlled the territory, the people living in those lands were still there. They exerted control on and influence in Rome's politics through their governors. So the Romans who were ruling in those lands still needed to keep their people happy, otherwise there would be revolts. So in the course of this video, what we're going to look at is we'll look at the early days of the empire, and then we'll take it all the way up until about the year 235. The follow-up video, which I will record later and should be releasing later this month, we'll pick up at 235 and run up until 306. And I'm sure that you'll understand why when we get there. So the early days of the Roman Empire are really marked by a sort of lack of a very provincial quality. Rome was basically a city-state, and so in terms of beardedness, the Roman fashion was to stay clean-shaven. Beards were associated with barbarians, they were associated with Greeks, they were associated with Germans and Celts, but they were not really something that Roman men wore. And so the early emperors all follow this style. They don't really have this look, um, and it's showing in a certain way their Roman identity. It's one of the ways in which they distinguish themselves from the people that they ruled. And so this is going to stay true for basically the first 80 years of the empire. Here we can see Augustus, and he's styling himself. In fact, he's actually styling himself after Alexander the Great here. Now, Nero is the first emperor that we know of to be depicted wearing a beard. And here you can see he's got his very fashionable bowl cut, and he has his nice chin strap neck beard. He just got off of modding his Discord server. Um, so sporting this style um, kind of was a break with tradition. The way that he wears it says, yeah, I can grow a beard, but I also know how to take myself seriously. He's telling you he's a straight talker, and not like those wily Greeks that cover their whole face. Rome was not ready at this point to accept such a radical departure from tradition, and Nero was abandoned by his own guardsmen and committed suicide after the Roman Senate condemned him. So it would be another 49 years before another emperor would wear a beard, and that is who we will talk about next. Kaiser Trajanus Hadrianus Augustus. That is this gentleman right here. You can see he was in 117 AD, and he's actually the second non-Italian emperor, and that's an interesting point. His predecessor was named Trajan. That's where the name comes from, and he is going to be very important. He's a lover of Greek culture. So Greek culture had a very controversial place in Roman society, where we tend to think of them as basically synonymous. In fact, Greek culture was quite controversial to the traditionalist Roman establishment. And so he was called the Philhellene, which means a lover of Greek culture. This beard style that he wears is called a philosopher's beard, and it was popular amongst Greek thinkers. And he is going to be one of the very popular emperors. He kind of removes a lot of the taboos that were established and present in Roman society and overcomes them. And he's also going to have a good number of accomplishments that will make his predecessors want to imitate him. And so we'll talk a little bit about one of those accomplishments. Rome had become very big at this point. So if you look here, the city of Rome itself is somewhere in this area right here, and it now controlled all of this. Um, and so on the next slide, we're going to take a look at a few of the more important territories that will be good to know about in this presentation. So during Hadrian's reign, Rome actually was at its greatest expanse. This is often considered by many people the height of Roman power. And the culture of those people, as much as we think of Rome pushing out and taking over these other places, the cultures of the people that they conquered also affected Rome. So in Egypt, you have Egyptian gods coming up and becoming popular in other places in Europe. You have metal from Britain and Spain being used to forge weapons and tools all over the rest of the empire. And the culture of different regions, especially Greek culture, becomes very important. And there's this great ecosystem spreading all around the Mediterranean, sharing all of these innovations. And so here's that larger map. We'll take a look at some of the different places. So here's Italy. And by this point, Italy had become more or less Romanized. There had been a few different cultures, and they'd all been united under Roman rule for a while now. Romans had taken up territory in different parts of Italy, and it's pretty good farmland. So this is where the wealthiest and most important Romans lived. Spain, this is where Hadrian and his predecessor had come from. And this was an important part of the empire for mining. Spain has a lot of mountains, so it's good metal territory. Another area that's going to become important is this region right here. This was called Syria. Still is called that, I guess. And this is important because this is the border with the Persian Empire, who were one of Rome's longtime rivals. And so this is a heavily militarized region. And you have a lot of people who are, you have a lot of generals who have very large armies in this region. And so in the politics of the empire, this is a very important zone. Whoever your general in the east is needs to be kept happy. Another region that has a lot of military reinforcement, which we're going to see come up again, is the Germanic frontier. This region is probably the area, if you know anything about Roman history, you know this is where most of the barbarians came from. When people talk about barbarian invasions, this is what's happening. And so this particular town right here, Caruntum, is going to become important in a little bit. A couple of other places that are good to keep in mind. Britain up here is another heavily militarized zone. The people who are on the island do not like the Romans. And so if you don't keep a lot of soldiers there, they're going to rise up. There's also the island was not completely taken over. There's also hostile people to the north up here. Um, and Egypt is another important spot. So Egypt and this part of Africa were extremely important for grain producing. And so they produce a very large number of grain. A lot of the grain from Africa here is just shipped directly over to Italy and Rome and used to support people living in the city. And we're going to see Africa become very important here in a little bit. So, one of the most remarkable things about Hadrian's career is, firstly, he was the first well-liked emperor that the Romans had had in a while. And he's also remarkable because he spent very little time in the city of Rome itself. And of all the Roman empires, Hadrian may have actually visited the most provinces out of any of them. So this meant that he was able to hold on to his kind of independence from the Senate in a way that other emperors couldn't. And so simultaneously, he earned a great deal of goodwill throughout the empire because he took on all of these building projects. And so when he died, his legacy was a popular one, and the man who followed him, Antoninus Pius, right here, um, had to show that he was his successor. And so the name Pius comes from the fact that when Hadrian died, he had him declared God. This sounds a little weird to us, but this was considered kind of you can think of Roman religion as being very heavily focused on ancestor worship. So him doing that showed that he was a God-fearing and very devout man, and so he was given the name Pius. Antoninus ruled in a time of peace, and he passed on the empire to his two sons. That would be these two gentlemen right here. And so these successors would split the empire. Um, this right here is Lucius Verus, who is Antoninus's biological son. And then this gentleman over here is a man that you might have heard of. His name is Marcus Aurelius. And he's very popular to this day because of the Stoic philosophy that he wrote. But he also was a competent emperor. And so they split the empire in half, and that made it much easier for them to actually manage it. Um, and this wasn't just an ease thing. It was also that the empire was becoming increasingly difficult to manage. So, where just having the legions out in the provinces was enough for previous emperors, now it was necessary for the emperor to actually be on the front lines. And so, the thing that's interesting about these two guys is that they spent very little time in the city of Rome itself. They would come back periodically, but in point of fact, especially Marcus Aurelius, by the end of his life, was spending the majority of his time out on that Germanic frontier fighting barbarians. And so by the time that he died in 180 AD, he had basically been out fighting barbarians for a good portion of his life. Um, and so this transition is very important, and it's going to become important later on in our narrative because previously emperors had basically been political representatives of the army. They commanded the loyalty of the troops, and that was why they were the highest man and the most powerful man in the empire. But by being in the empire, in the city, they still had to keep the senators happy. Um, all of these emperors spending time outside of the city of Rome, this shows how important it was to actually have authority out in the provinces commanding troops. But it also shows that being a present and capable military leader was becoming a more and more important part of what it means to be a Roman emperor. And this precedent is going to become very common indeed. In 180, as I say, Commodus, the son of Marcus Aurelius, became the emperor. And he almost immediately made peace with the Germans that his father had spent so many decades fighting. And he returned to Rome. And he actually is going to end up being a very present emperor. Uh, we'll talk about him a little bit more, but he became quite popular with the people to the point that he would participate in gladiatorial contests, and he was generally pretty well liked amongst the general populace, at least. The senators despised him, and in all of the writings that we have about him, he's basically called a tyrant and terrible, and he is kind of seen as this like decadent, ridiculous guy. And so eventually, he falls victim to an assassination plot. So let's talk about the year of the five emperors. So Commodus is assassinated, and he's in fact assassinated by the Imperial Guard, the people who are supposed to be protecting him. And so they didn't really, have a plan. They kind of go into a panic, and they select the only man who has a comparable beard, a man named Pertinax. And so they basically declare him emperor almost immediately. So Pertinax is no dummy. He sees how the previous emperor went out, and so he makes it his business to reform the Imperial Guard. And so the Imperial Guard sees this coming. They see what's coming down the pike, and so they respond by assassinating him. So now they really don't know what to do. The guy that they declared emperor just, was assassinated by their own hands. So they say, okay, how are we going to do this? Okay, let's just uh, let's just find somebody who will buy the imperial office. And so they eventually there's this bidding war between different citizens of the city of Rome, and this guy named Marcus Didius Julianus eventually wins that, and he's declared emperor. So Didius Julianus was declared emperor on 28 March. Word about this thing got out and it traveled, and it reached the provinces that the Imperial Guard was selling off the highest seat of power in the land to whoever the highest bidder was. And so by April, men around the empire were being declared emperor by their armies. So in Syria, you have this guy named Gaius Pescennius Niger. In Britain, another man by the name of Decimus Clodius Albinus, who was apparently called Albinus. If you don't know, Albinus means white, and he was apparently extremely pale. So that's where he got that name from. And in the Far East, in what's now Austria, in a fortress called Carnuntum, I told you that would come up again, a man named Lucius Septimius Severus was declared emperor by the 14th Legion. And if you're looking at the dates for these guys' reigns, I think you can guess how all of this turns out. There's basically a civil war, a struggle for power. Briefly, Clodius Albinus and Septimius Severus are allied with each other. Pescennius Niger is the first one to get knocked out. Then later on down the road, Clodius Albinus is defeated in battle, and Septimius Severus becomes the sole emperor of the Roman world. So, we've already seen that ruling a territory as large as the Roman Empire was a challenging proposition. In the year of the five emperors, generals from all over the far-flung provinces responded to the political situation in Italy with, if you're the Roman emperor, really frightening speed. And so if we set aside the specific circumstances of Commodus's reign, we can see that the problem here, the central problem, is that there weren't any particular mechanisms to pass on dynastic legitimacy. So if an emperor died without an established heir, there was no way to ensure that generals from the provinces didn't simply declare themselves rulers and set off another round of civil war. So it seems likely that Septimius Severus recognized this, and hoping to keep the peace, arrived at the conclusion that two emperors were required. Um, this, as I say, this had been done by Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus, but this wasn't really an established practice. So, what's going to happen is that Severus is going to father two sons, and he's going to be the first man to pass on the emperorship to his sons well, since Marcus Aurelius. So, he does a good job as the sole administrator. He keeps the peace pretty well. And one of the interesting things, to just make a quick digression, is that he's actually from Africa. So he is from the region of Africa, that sort of little pointy area in the north. And under him, the civilizations of Africa actually become more important than they had been. So Septimius Severus kind of leads a Carthaginian, the civilization of Africa before Rome had been called Carthage, and he kind of leads a Carthaginian Renaissance. So Septimius Severus's sons were granted joint rule of the empire in 211, and in fact, they were brothers. Um, Now, theoretically, there were a lot of options that they had available to them. There was a wide open field here. There was no specific way that they might have, like previously established practice. And so they could have set up joint rule in whatever way they wanted to. Um, so for a little while, they discussed this idea of splitting the empire in half. Their mom doesn't like that idea. And so they just quarrel more and more, and they really don't get along with each other. Um, this on the left is Publius Septimius Geta. This on the right, his name is, he's commonly known in the histories as Caracalla. And based on the beards, I think you can guess that this doesn't work out for one of them. They just didn't get along, and they quarreled so much. Eventually, in the same year that they were declared emperors, Caracalla just has his brother killed. So Geta is assassinated by some guards, and he's murdered right in front of their mother. He died in her arms. And so this fresco here is kind of an amazing find. It depicts the imperial family. It's basically all official places of government were required to have an image like this of the royal family. And so it was kind of like a symbol of who the ultimate authority in the empire was. And so when Caracalla became emperor, he ordered all images of his brother be destroyed. I don't know where this particular statue came from. Maybe somebody buried it in their backyard or something. But on this fresco, Geta's face has been removed. So somebody kept their fresco. Whoever the administrator of that particular place was kept their fresco, and they just destroyed Geta's image. Like, oh, don't know who that is. Never heard of him. Um, and so this happens all across the empire, and it wasn't just images. Bloody purges were conducted. Um, Anyone who had supported Geta, officials, low-level administrators appointed by him, just people who had supported him or been friendly with him. And so this process of violence is eventually going to give Caracalla the sole authority in the empire. And also give him a pretty nasty reputation. I think you can kind of see that in his expression there. Doesn't look like a super pleasant guy. And so in the process of doing this, Caracalla makes a lot of enemies, and so the way I would think about what comes next is almost as a way to placate people who had survived the violence. The idea of Italians ruling the Roman Empire is gone. That's over. And now, all over the empire, the administration is full of people who are not Roman at all. They are a lot of the times not just ancestors of people who were conquered by the Romans centuries ago. Um, they are just people who are living in the provinces and have been ruled by Romans all their lives. And so in 212, just 1 year after Caracalla became emperor and assassinated his brother, he issued an edict that said that, look, all free males who have lived in this empire their entire lives, they're not citizens. Because prior to that, they had a different status. They were considered to be subjects of the empire, but they were not considered to be citizens. And so this does a lot. This makes all sorts of new positions open up to people, and it also makes them eligible for military service in a way that they hadn't been. And so this is sort of a acceleration of a process or a ratification of a process that had been happening across the empire for a while. So if we look at the Year of the Five Emperors, which we just did a moment ago, that all three of the men who rose up against Didius Julianus were non-Italians. Septimius Severus and, in fact, Clodius Albinus were both Africans, in fact. So this had been going on for a while, and citizenship was already not exclusive to Italians, but it was not as pervasive as it becomes under the Constitutio Antoniniana. Antoniniana. Let's go with that. And so this is going to get more people involved or have a stake in the Roman government in a way that simply hadn't been possible before. Now, I hope by this point you've kind of picked up on a recurring theme, which is that the Roman Empire is really reliant on the actual person of whoever happens to be the emperor. And so this came in part from the importance of the Roman aristocracy. The empire essentially functions on a system of honors and social ranks. And so the Rome basically has a couple of different social classes. The most important are the senators, who made up the sort of legislative body. They did what we would call legislative work, and they made up the sort of governing class of the Roman city. And then there were the equites, who essentially that translates to knight, and they were basically the military class. Below this were the ordines, who were the ordinary citizens, and the ordinary citizens didn't have as many rights or privileges as these upper two classes did. They had a kind of in order to be considered for these classes, you had to maintain a certain level of wealth. So if your family lost enough money, then you could be removed from the ranks of the senators or the equites. And so previously, every man who had been Roman emperor up to this point was from the senatorial class. And so this process of essentially the militarization of the empire is going to continue because this man, Marcus Severus Macrinus, is from the Equites. He is not of the traditional ruling class, but he ends up being accepted by the ruling class, essentially because the Caracalla was so heavily disliked. And so he orchestrates the assassination of Caracalla, and he becomes the emperor himself. And so the Severan dynasty doesn't end here. Um, he it's going to continue, but in a different form. So these are all people who are technically continuations of the Severan dynasty. This is Marcus Opellius Antoninus Didyomenianus, and he is actually the son of Macrinus. Um, and he doesn't last very long. He and his dad don't last very long. They're quickly shuffled out and replaced by a cousin of the Severans. Elagabalus is the name that he's known to by history. Um, and so the Severan dynasty goes on, but each succeeding member had less and less relation to the foundation of the dynasty, and each emperor who followed was less independent. Um, and so you essentially have a child rule, right? They are puppet emperors essentially. They are, uh, very limited in their capabilities, and in some cases, for a while, they're actual children. Um, Diadumenian was only 9 years old. Elagabalus was 18 when he was assassinated. And, by all accounts, he acted the way that a 17, 18-year-old would act with unlimited power. And Alexander Severus, he lasts a little bit longer, but he's only 26 when he eventually is assassinated. And so this problem of emperors being assassinated, and that's the way that political change happens, um, it's starting to become a real problem. It's starting to just become the means by which imperial succession occurs. And so eventually, what you have is the fact that the Severans attempted to establish a dynasty, but they, because they were from outside the traditional Roman ruling circle, um, and they enabled all of this social mobility, the thought that occurs to the citizens throughout to people living throughout the empire is not gratitude necessarily to the dynasty, but, well, now that there's no difference between us and the emperor, why shouldn't I be the emperor? Um, different provinces are left out in the cold, and there's all of these barbarian incursions, tons of different problems throughout. There's plagues and inflation, which we'll talk about in the next episode. And so the final Severan emperor angers his troops by paying tribute to the German Alemanni for whatever reason. He didn't think it was the right time to fight a war. And this really upsets the troops. They think that this means that he doesn't believe that he thinks that they're not manly enough to win the war. And so they collaborate with his imperial guard to assassinate him. And they establish a man who was a longtime general, Maximinus Thrax. He's very impressive as a person. He is uh, by all reports, extremely tall, 7 feet or 8 feet tall, according to some of the sources that we have. And he is exactly the kind of person that if a bunch of soldiers are just proclaiming whoever they want to be in charge, he's exactly the kind of person that a bunch of meatheads would select. And so this was not acceptable to the Senate. They had really liked Alexander Severus, and they pulled these two men from Africa, Gordian the First and Gordian the Second, and they set them up as rival emperors. And so this is going to start a process of civil war and rival emperors, different people claiming the throne, and that is what we are going to talk about in our next episode. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this, please check out my Patreon at patreon.com/historyspeaks. I put out new videos every Thursday. Don't forget to leave this video a like, and if you enjoyed it, subscribe so that you can see part 2 when it comes out. Have a great rest of your day, and I'm looking forward to the next time we speak.